Securely supporting our steel frame on 4 jack stands is the first step in building our MG-TD chassis. We find that elevating it approximately 18 inches off of the floor works best. Before we install our forward rear axle and suspension, we must make a few modifications. After turning the assembly over so that the springs are on top, we remove the 4 nuts that secure the U-bolts to the combination spring and shock mounts on each side. Previously, we had liberally applied penetrating oil to the nuts. This oil is available at any auto supply or hardware store. When the nuts have been removed, we pull off the spring mount and remove the U-bolts. We then remove the retaining bracket from the spring. Since we won't be using any of the hardware, we can discard it. Placing our spring in a vise, we use a China marker to draw a line approximately 2 inches behind the center anchor nut of the spring. This is the shackle end of the spring. It will be necessary to have the spring cut at this mark. We aren't going to attempt to cut the spring ourselves. The hacksaw is merely for demonstration. Rear leaf springs are hardened steel. We'll send them out to a welder or to a machine shop. They'll make the cuts with a torch or an abrasive cutting wheel. Here we have our properly modified spring. The rubber insulator has been removed and we have inspected the front bushing. When we find worn or deteriorating parts, we replace them with new parts available from our local auto supply store or Ford parts department. 2 new spring mounting plates were furnished with our replica assembly kit. Since we have a left and a right, we position each mount against the flat bracket on the bottom of the axle assembly, making certain that the shock mounting tab on each plate is inside and to the rear. Special hardened U-bolts along with flanged lock nuts have been supplied with the kit. We use these to attach the spring mounting plates. The entire rear axle assembly along with the brakes were cleaned and inspected earlier. Any worn or deteriorating parts were replaced. We used a quality primer to paint the unit. Later, we will paint everything with a high-quality black enamel paint. For visibility during filming, the primer will be left on. The appropriate socket extension and ratchet are used to tighten the nuts on each side. The bushing at the end of each spring is placed between the mounting flanges on each bracket. After the holes are properly aligned, an original Ford bolt and nut are used. When necessary, we gently tap the bolts with a hammer to secure each spring to its mount. The correct nuts secured from our Ford parts department are used because Ford specifically recommends that all used leaf spring mounting hardware be replaced. The appropriate tools are used to securely tighten the nuts and bolts. For visual reference, we have painted many hardware components yellow or another color. After we've installed the original tires, we place our floor jack under the differential at the center of the axle assembly and position it under our new frame. We place the center anchor nut on each side into the center holes, located in the frame mounting plates. 3/8" diameter by 2.5" long grade 5 bolts with lock washers, flat washers, and nuts are used to secure the spring retainers we position under the spring. The correct tools are used to tighten the bolts. Grade 5 bolts can be distinguished by 3 lines on the bolt head. Bolt diameter is the size of the shank. Bolt length is measured from the underside of the head to the end of the shaft. New rear shock absorbers were obtained from our local auto supply store at a very reasonable cost. We are now going to install them. These shock absorbers are direct Pinto replacements, and they come with new mounting hardware. We have chosen the heavy-duty variety for our application. After placing a metal washer and rubber bushing on the bottom mounting stud, we place it through the hole in the spring mount. Install the outer rubber bushing and metal washer, and thread a nut on the stud. Then we extend the shock upward and secure it to the top mount in the same manner. After repeating this procedure on the other side, we tighten the nuts securely with the appropriate socket and ratchet. Our shock absorber installation is now complete. A special metal bracket and adjustable rear link rod come with the Replica kit. They will now be installed. After the 2 top and 2 right side bolts have been removed from the differential cover plate, we position the link mount. Four 5/16" diameter by 1 3/4" long grade 8 bolts with an 18 thread are screwed into the housing. A flat washer and lock washer are placed under each head. We jiggle the bracket to get the bolts started. At times, we find it's necessary to slightly enlarge the bracket holes to achieve proper fit. Once all 4 bolts have been threaded into the housing, we use the correct socket and ratchet to tighten them securely. We alternate between each bolt, tightening them a little at a time. In order to install the adjustable rear link, we first thread the jam nuts, then the rod ends onto the threaded rear link rod. Once the rod ends are in place, we secure the front rod end to the mount, located on the chassis, with a 1/2" diameter by 2.5" long grade 5 bolt with 3 flat washers, a lock washer, and nut. Normally, we prefer to use a lock nut in place of a lock washer for this particular application. We then lift the differential at the rear to align the rear mounting bracket with the hole at the back of the rod end. A 1/2" diameter by 3.5 to 4" long grade 5 bolt, along with 3 flat washers, a lock washer, and nut are used to secure the rod. Again, we prefer to use a lock nut in place of a lock washer. We tighten the nuts and bolts with the correct tools. One end is left loose. It will be necessary to adjust the rear end only when the engine and transmission have been installed. In order to adjust the rod, one end must be disconnected. Later, after the rear link has been properly adjusted, we will tighten the jam nuts. Our rear end installation is now completed. In order for our MGTD to have the correct ride height, it is necessary to remove one, and only one, full coil from the bottom of each spring. First, we mark the spring. Then we cut the coil with a hacksaw equipped with a special carbide blade, available from our local hardware store. Since the springs are hardened steel, patience is required. In most cases, we have the springs cut by our local welder or machine shop, sending them out at the same time as the rear springs. After we've cut the springs, we file or grind a 1.5-inch taper at the cut end. This will fit into the recess on the lower control arm. Next, we place the front lower control arm bushing inside of the front cross member. After aligning the holes in the cross member with the lower control arm bushing, we insert the original Ford bolt, tapping it gently with a hammer when necessary. The nut is screwed onto the end and tightened securely with the appropriate tools. We then repeat the procedure on the other side. Later, we will return and tighten the nut with a torque wrench to the specifications listed in our service manual. Before we install our new gas tank that came with our assembly kit, we want to put some rubber on the frame surfaces that come into contact with the flanges on the tank. We use several strips of rubber matting used for stairway tread, available from our local home center. Later, when we install our floor liner, we will use more of this material. 3M 1300 rubber cement is used to glue the 2 rubber strips to the frame. Our gas tank is now placed into position with the fuel filler neck on the left or driver's side. We allow approximately 2.5 inches between the side of the tank and frame on the driver's side. Our electric drill, along with a 3/16-inch drill bit, is used to drill 3 holes through each mounting flange and top surface of the frame cross pieces. Six 1/4-inch by 3/4-inch hex washer head self-tapping screws are used to secure the gas tank to the frame. We'll come back in a few minutes to install our fuel lines. The brake differential valve we removed from our donor car was inspected and thoroughly cleaned in brake fluid. After locating this valve against the frame brace just in front of the firewall upright, we drilled 2 3/8-inch holes through the brace.